Hello everyone, this is Shruti from Document 360, the co-organizer of this webinar. Thank you for joining the session today. Today we have Danielle Vansia, Senior Technical Writer, Vantage, with us to speak on the topic Collaborative Writing on Technical Teams. Danielle Vansia has experience in the EdTech, healthcare, and fintech sectors. She currently focuses on developing product documentation and technical marketing content. In today's webinar, she will explore the concept of collaborative writing on technical teams with specific focus on developing an effective peer review process. Danielle will also share how to incorporate reviews into Docs as code workflow with the documentation team. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So I would request to key in your questions on the Q&A platform so that our team can collate and hand them over to us. Thank you. Danielle, you can start the presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. Hello, and thank you for joining this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing here. So the topic today that I'm going to be talking about is collaborative writing on technical teams, and with a specific focus on establishing an effective peer review process. A little about me first. I am a technical writer at Vantage. Vantage is a cloud cost optimization tool. So I specifically work on the product documentation, but I also do work on creating technical blog content, which is something that's new for me in technical writing. I've been a technical writer for a while. I've got experience in EdTech, health tech, FinOps, and open source. Technical writing was not my first career. I actually came into technical writing by way of higher education, but I found that there was a lot of crossover between the two fields, and technical writing was a natural fit for me. I have my information below. Feel free to reach out after the presentation. I love connecting. I love speaking with other writers, and I believe these slides will be posted later on, so that information will be there as well. So what are we going to be talking about today? First, we're going to discuss collaborative writing, and specifically peer reviews. We'll talk about different types of peer reviews, how to establish a peer review process in your organization, how to conduct a peer review, so both giving and receiving feedback, and just overall kind of best practices. So what is collaborative writing? It's using your team members, other people on your team's expertise and diverse experiences to improve as a group. One of my most favorite things about technical writing is the fact that many people come to the field from so many other different fields. I find it so unique to just have other team members who have come from other careers, who have worked in different organizations, whether it's a startup or a very large multinational organization. So oftentimes writers will have very diverse and unique experiences that they'll bring to the table. They've worked with many different style guides. They've worked on implementing many different processes in their organizations. So bringing all of that knowledge to the table is fantastic because you get to learn from each other, and especially in a peer review process where you're kind of sharing your thoughts about each other's work. It's really probably one of my most favorite things about technical writing. Collaborative writing also ensures consistency across a product and docs, having that one consistent voice, specifically in product documentation, so it doesn't feel like 5 different people wrote it. Having a peer review or collaborative writing process allows you to really take a look at the work as a whole and establish that one voice together as a team. Of course, there's challenges with things like this. For example, writing styles. You can give 3 different technical writers a piece of content to edit, review, or write, and you might, of course, come out with 3 different end results. None of these are actually wrong, but at the same time, writing styles obviously differ. It could lead to some really great discussions, though, about how you would want to word something, but that can be a challenge as well. Time constraints, of course. When you are working on a product, trying to get out a release, and you're working on the documentation, a lot of times this can be a very tight turnaround. Oftentimes, if you're doing specifically product documentation, you are the last step in the release process after the feature is created. So you have a much quicker turnaround time to turn these things around. We'll talk about how building a peer review process into the workflow and making it a natural part of the workflow can help you with some of these time constraints. And most importantly, working collaboratively on writing projects is about communication and coordination. That's the most important thing in any form of work, but it allows you to really connect with your team members. It's also really great in remote work environments. It's allowed me to really form these connections with other writers that I've worked with. I've been remote for the past 4 years on different technical writing teams, and this sort of adding peer review to our workflow has allowed me to really connect with other members on my team. So I just put this quote here, but essentially, what is a peer review? It's a critical step in the writing process. You can assess and provide feedback on each other's work. Peer reviews help identify errors, inconsistencies, and areas for improvement. So not only is it about seeing where something might be off, but for areas for improvement, it's how can you grow as a team? If you're working to follow a specific style guide, are there areas where certain team members are interpreting it certain ways, or are there areas where maybe the team can grow together? But most importantly, it's about consistency and quality. So it's consistency across your documentation base, ensuring that the actual product documentation is a cohesive voice, and it elevates the quality of the work. It ensures that the documentation is being written for the end user, for who it is meant for. So there's a couple of different types of peer reviews, and they are all meant for sort of different types of technical writing or different areas or different like education or scientific writing. So formal review is a structured and predefined set of guidelines. It's extremely formal. Think about complex technical documents or research papers. It might go up against a review committee. This is the most formal you can get. It's often going to be for something academic or potentially scientific writing, medical writing. So if you work in a field where there's a lot more kind of regulatory needs, a formal review is definitely something that you would want to set up. On the other side is a more informal review. So these are going to be your peer-to-peer exchanges without that formal sort of feedback. It could even be if you have like a weekly stand-up or a writing sync, that you're just giving sort of a draft to the team and everybody could take a look at it, give their sort of feedback. It could also be if you use Slack or Microsoft Teams, just posting a draft of something or a part of your draft and seeking feedback from team members that way. It's flexible, it's open to team discussion, it's great for brainstorming. So between formal and informal, there's of course a middle ground where you could have a little bit more of a structured process, but it doesn't necessarily have an intense rubric or a very structured turnaround times. And then there's also an anonymous review. Again, this might be more for a academic or scholarly context. It's where both the author and reviewer are completely unaware of each other. And that's just so there's no bias of the actual author. And again, this is something that's probably intended for more of a scholarly context, but it is also interesting to think about maybe just having anonymous reviews to look at each other's work, to rotate work around as well. So how do you establish a peer review process? The most important thing is to build it into your current workflow. It should become a natural part of the workflow. Pointed out here, docs as code. If you haven't heard of that before, docs as code is the idea that you treat your documentation just like code. So you're doing a lot of the same processes with documentation that you would with code review. So potentially using a version control system like GitHub or GitLab. You're checking in that information, you're opening pull requests or merge requests, you're having it reviewed that way. Working the peer review process into that actual docs as code workflow fits very naturally. You may already be seeking feedback and review from a subject matter expert like a product owner or an engineer. So having a second review using comments within that version control system will fit very well with the whole process. I would say that a peer review is more often than not separate from the tech review. Again, with a tech review from a product owner or an engineer, those individuals are looking to ensure that what you've written meets the requirements of a product, it's explaining the technology correctly. Whereas with the peer review, it's looking more at style, it's looking more at this new piece of documentation in the context of your larger documentation repository and ensuring it follows the guidelines and fits in well with the rest of the information that you already have there. I think it's important that you use your existing tool set if you can and not try to introduce another tool into the workflow. Again, it gets more buy-in both internally and externally, and it just fits really well with the process that you already have. The other thing you want to think about up front is who reviews who and if there's a rotation. If you have different levels of tech writers, for example, if you have senior tech writers, junior tech writers, potentially interns, or even other levels, are the more senior level writers reviewing junior writers, or does it even matter? I've actually been on both different types of review processes, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But you want to decide who is going to review who, and is there a rotation? Are reviewees assigned to the same reviewer, or does that rotate around? There's definitely pros and cons to both sides. So a very basic workflow of what this might look like: you'd write a draft of whatever it is, your feature, content, release notes, whatever it might be. You'd send it to the reviewer. Could be a 2-day to 4-day turnaround. Again, that's going to very much depend on the size of the work. You would incorporate the feedback from your reviewer, potentially a 1 to 2-day turnaround. If there is a tech or subject matter expert review, that's typically about a 1-week turnaround, and then you publish the doc. So what you're looking at here is potentially another up to 6 days added to the process, which seems like a lot, but over time, as you incorporate peer review into the workflow, often your work's going to become a lot better in the sense that there won't be as many errors, because you're understanding, you're incorporating this feedback, you're learning from it, you're learning from each other. So those turnaround times are going to be a lot quicker because it's going to be less to review, it's going to be less to adjust. So again, in the beginning, it might be a little bit longer just depending upon the work, but those turnaround times could definitely decrease. And I have seen this work really well in a couple of different contexts. So the other thing to think about is team size. I'm going to speak from personal experience here. I've been on very small, medium, and very large size teams, and there's been a peer review process on each one of those teams, and I'll just talk about how that's worked in my experience. So I'm currently on a team of 2. It's me and one other writer, and we have a very informal review process, only because as a very small team, we're both very busy and we have a lot going on. And I think what's great about this is we make it so that we're not required to review every single piece of work from each other. We really just review high touch pieces and provide feedback. We have a Docs Code workflow, so we are checking in documentation into GitHub. We're seeking review so for me, I specifically work on the product documentation. If it's a brand new feature, I will tag an engineer to review that as well to ensure that I'm describing what our product can do correctly. But the peer review part of it, I will put out, say, a technical blog, and I'll ask the other writer to review and give their input and feedback. Very informal, optional. It works well for a very small team, and we've learned a lot from it. And I honestly think that over the past couple of months, we've both definitely improved our writing because we both came from very different industries and lines of work. So it's definitely helped a lot. In a previous position, I was on a bit of a larger team, as about 10 different writers. I'll call that medium team. And we had a rotational process. Initially, a reviewer and a reviewee would be paired, and they would have to review one piece of work from each other per week for the month. And that actually wound up being a lot. We were a very busy team. We were reviewing technical course content, so we always had work coming in. And what we realized was it was just too much work to be reviewing. So I worked with our other senior writer, and we created a process. It was a rotational process where you only needed to review 2 pieces of work from your assigned partner per month. And then the partners would meet up and just discuss their findings, They would talk about maybe if there were things missing from the style guide or if there were some misunderstandings. And at the end of the month in our monthly sync, the whole team would meet up and we would just discuss what we learned overall. It was very effective and it was very helpful. We had a very informal spreadsheet rubric. And again, we didn't really have like a tool for putting this in, but it was very helpful in the process to just kind of track things over time. And that worked really well. Reviewers and reviewees were rotated over the months, and it didn't matter if you were a senior or junior writer, you would just be paired with somebody. A much more formalized process. I worked on a very large team. It was about 60 writers spread out across 3 different offices. It was very formal in that there were higher level writers and they would review junior writers or writers who had just started. You would be reviewed to the same reviewer over time. Our work, we used Jira as our project management tool. So you would open a subtask to your reviewer in Jira. They would score you. There was a rubric. It was very, very formalized. Where this worked really well for me personally was that this was when I just got into the field of technical writing. So it actually really helped me as a writer to grow my skills. Again, it was super formalized and there was official dates and turnaround times that were established. So our entire SLA or turnaround time for getting, say, a set of release notes out, it was built into the process that you needed to add 3 extra days to give it to the reviewer. It did work well, and for me, it was really helpful. You could graduate from this process. So over time, if you did really well, you were scoring well on the rubric, you no longer needed to be reviewed. So where this worked well was a very large team in that helping junior technical writers to advance and really learn our style guide. We had a very formalized style guide as well. So what is it that you measure in any sort of peer review? Of course, it's going to be things like spelling, punctuation, grammar, the simple things, the technical copy editing sort of things. But you also want to think about format, design, and the template. So for format, if you're writing something, say in Markdown or restructured text or some sort of markup language, you want to ensure that you are using markup consistently across the entire piece. So for example, if you are bolding a button or UI name, you're doing that consistently and you're not just like in another step italicizing it or underlining it or whatever it might be. You're following your style guide. It looks like another piece of content. So if you have, say, a guide for how to integrate certain products with your product, those integration pages are similar looking in template. You give the prerequisites, you give, additional references, and those are looking similar. And then just overall design, again, if you are working on sort of a front end, whether it's a knowledge base or a website, a documentation site, that when you load that and you put it out in production, or really putting it out in a test space first, that it looks nice, everything loads correctly, there's no broken links. And then the other side of it is terminology, level, and code. So terminology, ensuring that you're correctly using terminology. If you are, for example, something I recently worked on was related to Kubernetes, and so I had to learn a lot of Kubernetes related terminology. So are you using that terminology correctly? And also for the end user who's reading it, if they're not as familiar with acronyms, you are defining acronyms on first use. You're writing to the level of the user who needs to read this. So if it's a very basic intro guide for an end user, you are writing it so that it is for that user. There's not really steps about, settings and admin type tasks in there. It's specifically for that end user. And then I put in about code QA. Again, oftentimes you're going to be getting a technical or subject matter expert review, but there's a lot of things as technical writers we can review in terms of code samples. Are you using double quotes and single quotes inconsistently? Does the indentation look good? If you're able to, you could test it out for the other writer and point out things there. So these are all things that as a peer you can look at during a peer review. So I have a very basic example here. This is just a set of fake instructions for an application where you create a reminder just to show you some of the things that you might look at in a peer review. If you look at this, there's some obvious mistakes here. So for example, with punctuation, the very basic spelling, punctuation, things like that, you could point out, well, this is missing a period in this step. All the other steps have periods, so there's that inconsistency there as well. Grammar and syntax, clicking on, add reminder. That whole step one sounds a little funny. It could probably be rewritten to be a bit more of an imperative step. So to input reminder details, click add reminder or something along those lines. Spelling, of course, very important. Hopefully you're catching a lot of those spelling mistakes before it's getting to peer review, but it's always great to have a second pair of eyes. Here, date is, of course, spelled wrong. Consistency. So in this example, add reminder, we're going to assume is a button or a UI object, and there's quotes around it, whereas in step 4, click save. Save is probably a button as well. It's lowercase, there's no quotes, it's not bolded like reminders and title. So just those consistency in formatting UI objects. In step 3, we have users can add, however, you is used in other steps. So that consistent voice, the, whether you're writing in second person, whatever, you want to ensure that's consistent. And then just overall style. If you have a style guide here, the serial comma is not used. Again, that's specific to maybe your style guide, but you want to ensure that you're being consistent that way as well, that you're following the style guide that you normally follow. All of these are specific things that you can point out in a peer review and discuss. And let's talk about actually giving feedback, because I think that's very important too. The way that you give feedback can go a long way, rather than just marking things off and saying, this is wrong, this is no good. There's a way that you can structure your feedback and comments to be a lot more actionable. It's really important, and it opens up room for discussion. It's important to point out both what is and what is not working. So not just pointing out errors, but I think it's actually very important and really helpful to point out, hey, this is actually working really well. And it's good because you can incorporate that into your own work, or it's something to bring up to the team. Maybe there's a way someone's structuring things that you've never seen it done that way before. So definitely highlight it and point it out. There's a website that I like to follow, and I've used this in a previous role. It's called conventionalcomments.org. And what they say is, by simply prefixing the comment, so any sort of peer review comment, with a label, the intention is clear and the tone dramatically changes. So they have a little sort of template for it. Where this works really well is if you are doing like comments in GitHub or GitLab, doing code review type comments, or Docs' code review comments that way. It's really nice to parse, or really easy to parse and read through these sort of comments. So typically you'll have a label, decorations might be some sort of topic, and subject and discussion. So that looks like suggestion, style, can change, click on to click for brevity. And speaking of brevity, it makes it just very short and easy to read through. But seeing these sort of throughout, you might have things like to do, or just something, maybe just a sort of comment or feedback. You don't necessarily have to include this, but it might be better that way. And it opens up that room for discussion, but it's not just this long drawn out comment where the actual action you need to take gets lost. It's very straightforward. Now, there's giving feedback, but there's also receiving feedback. Receiving feedback is definitely a part of technical writing. You're getting feedback from subject matter experts, product owners, whoever that might be, your manager, and then your peers. Receiving feedback is super important, but we all can recognize that it can be difficult sometimes, especially the first time that you start a technical writing position or at a new organization. I've been there. It's definitely nerve-wracking to submit work for the first time. So just remember to take in that feedback. It's going to just help you improve overall. Use it to improve your writing. Any feedback is good feedback. People are reading your work, and you know maybe where you need to improve or work on. But what if you don't agree? Yes, there's sometimes going to be times where you might get something where someone says, hey, I think this would be reworded better this way. And maybe it wouldn't, maybe it would. But that's okay. It's good to be able to have those discussions. And I think it opens up a really interesting conversation. I have had some really interesting conversations where we got really excited about, oh, a comma could go here or not. That's fine. That's really a lot of the excitement of technical writing is discussing with your peers on how things could be done. And that's okay. You don't always have to agree. At the end of the day, you are the writer who is working on the piece, and it's kind of up to you to really decide how you want to structure the final product. So just kind of wrapping things up overall on what we've talked about, establishing that peer review on your team. Important, obtain stakeholder buy-in. That's going to be whether it's, depending upon how your team is set up, whether it's a tech writing manager, lead of product, whoever that might be, so that they understand that this process will be built into your technical writing process overall. But you also want to obtain buy-in from the rest of your team. Discuss it as a team, bring it up, talk about it in your tech writing syncs or stand-ups, and work on it together. Kind of when everybody gives their opinion and establishes the process together, you get that buy-in from other writers. Build the process around your team size and bandwidth. Like I talked about, I'm on a very, very small team right now. It would be impossible to review every single piece of each other's work. So just build that around your bandwidth and really like the size of your team. Determine the rotation schedule. Are reviewers going to be the same reviewers for the same reviewees, or are you going to rotate that around? Does it matter what the level of the writer is? Establish turnaround times and SLAs. Build that into your workflow. Establish that, okay, for someone to review my work, I need to give them 2 days. Let me build that into getting things done while they're reviewing my work. I can start on the next thing. Use your existing tool set so it becomes a much more natural part of the process. Use the tools, whether it's project management tools like Asana and Jira or GitHub and GitLab, whatever it might be. Try to build it into what you're already working with, and discuss the review criteria. Are you just going to say, hey, I would expect that spelling, grammar, things like that are completed and we don't have to worry about those things at this point. I'm only going to focus on format and design. Or is it going to be a full review, a full copy edit review? That's something you'll want to discuss up front. And of course, iterate as you go. No process is perfect. Like I talked about in a previous role, we had a process started where we realized it was just too much going on and we completely revamped things. And that's fine. You learn from it. You'll get some actionable results as you go along, and you'll be able to just readjust as you go along.
Thank you, Danielle, for the presentation. On behalf of entire Document 360, I thank everyone who joined the session, and I hope it was a great session for you all. The entire session is recorded and will be uploaded to our website soon in case you want to come back and see it along with the presentation deck. Thank you. We will be back again with yet another session. Goodbye.